Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Peace. Um, I'm, I'm very, very grateful to the invitation that I received from Professor Grant Underwood. And this is my first visit to Utah. And I've fallen in love with this place. It's so beautiful. And I want to share with you something that is important to keep in mind, that in my life of teaching religious studies for last 54 years, I'm 80 years old, I'm not young, but I started quite early. I always learned to respect other religions. I can teach Christianity as respectfully as I teach Islam. There's nothing that will fall short in my approach to any other communities. And I believe that there's a purpose for which I have been created. If I were to engage in the diversity, then I would start with saying that I wasn't a privileged undergraduate whose parents were rich to send him to America to be educated. I was orphaned from the age of 10. And I remember coming home from the school and my mother didn't have food on the table. That's the life that I saw and I was brought up in. So I have a special relationship with all human beings. But I'm also aware that we don't like to speak about disagreements. Muslims are no different. They don't want to speak about the differences among themselves, whether it is interpretive differences, theological differences, legal differences, or ethical differences. There's a fear that if we engage in bringing out differences, we might then endanger our claim to the truth, which is being held by the majority. Majority always is afraid that minority should not be given the voice. Otherwise, they might expose some of the irregularities that the majority are practicing. It's been true with all religious communities. I've gone around the world 3 times, each and every country I visited. And I was always interested in human beings, wherever I went. And what I realized was that polemics is part of the self-identity. We do engage in polemics in order for our own self-identification. Not only that, it is also a claim to be my position, to be the only position that is right. It is to become self-righteous. And all the founders of religions were knowledgeable about that. There was a fear in the minds of even the founders of the religion that lest our followers become intolerant toward those who don't accept the message. So there was always room made for those disagreements. But we are living in the world of technology, in the world of cyberspace. Anything that happens anywhere in the world today, we know it within seconds. We are no more private. My sons tell me that our televisions that we see are actually spying on us. They know what we are watching. They know what things we are, interested in. That's why they show us these things. And my son, who I'm not so savvy about technology, but they come and they teach me. Haven't you seen that you are looking for a pair of shoes and how you open the your computer and the pairs of shoes come to show you, as if they know that you are looking for it. In the world of differences, what I have noticed with the Shia and the Sunni communities today, technology has become the tool of mutual attacks on one another. We are now talking about red Shiism, which is opening history for the first time for the communities in any part of the world. COVID-19 was an opening for people to sit home and watch the speaker they wanted to listen to. It was no more one speaker in one part of the world, who was locally available to the audience in that part. Now we can hear from London, from France, I don't know from where, and we can hear the preachers of different caliber and different program. What we are hearing on the programs is extremely dangerous, because it is going to smash the bridges of understanding and create even more difficulties. My sister Tyra, she presented us very sources of doctrinal, theological, legal differences that might exist. But there's something more that is going on. Rituals are being revived to create what we call mutual misunderstanding. What is important to keep in mind is that modern theology has not been formulated by any of the religious communities. I'm talking about Muslims. They're not talking about new kalam. They're not talking about new theology anymore. Theologies were written down in those centuries that Tahira spoke so well about them. These doctrines were formulated in the Middle Ages of Islam, and they are still dominant in the way we see each other. The universal language has not emerged in this new theology. And that new universal language is the language of ethics. We've been hearing about communities engaged in talking to one another, but the language is still the language of condemnation. There is takfir that is being done. We call that Shiism in Toronto now, red Shiism. So there's red Shiism, there's green Shiism. I don't know about other communities, but I know some of these groups that meet to condemn other Muslims for not being part of them. And this is extremely, I think, unknown in the annals of the religious differences. There's been lots and lots of battles fought between Sunnis and the Shias, the Mughal Empire, the Safavid Empire, the Ottoman Empire. They did not agree with one another. And there were political reasons for them to fight. And yet, the religious reasons were also used to separate the people. The Safavids were not innocent. The Ottomans were not innocent either. One was the Sunni, and the other was the Shia. And there was this struggle going on. Mughal Empire in India also had the rulers, some of them were Shia inclined, some of them were not. In other words, you have differences of dynasties that created their own theologies and their own sources of justification of power and authority. So we have inherited diversity, but not always as a source of celebration, rather as a source of mutual suspicion. And mutual suspicion creates what we call, it damages spirituality. Because spirituality, if it is equality of all human beings, then we are utterly failing the moment we reduce other human beings to a dehumanized position. And that's what religion is capable of doing. Today, that kind of understanding is extremely dangerous. I spent 2015 6 months in Iran and 6 months in Iraq. And both these countries have their own understanding of their own identity. There are voices that are trying to create tolerant situation. They don't want to engage in polemics anymore. Ayatollah Khamenei, for example, is firmly believing that some of the volumes that have been written in the past in the Arabic language should not be republished at all because they are the source of animosity among Muslims. That is not being appreciated in India and Pakistan, who want that to be kept alive. In other words, there are battles being fought within the community, intra-faith. I think that I want to interject here, transcript somewhat, that there is no dialogue between Muslims talking to one another. Even the scholars are not talking to one another, leave alone the people, ordinary people. I don't regard myself Shia anymore. I am being labeled by Shia, by my colleagues, by everyone, because I wrote books about Shiism that are controversial. My first book on Islamic Messianism is highly controversial, for which there was a fatwa issued against me by Ayatollah Sistani, that I am no more allowed to speak in the Muslim communities. I'm not allowed to speak in the Shia communities. I'm persona non grata for all of the Shia organizations. But Iran, it has invited me. Iraq, I have been there. And although the Ayatollah Sistani is in Iraq, Iraq has not obeyed the rule, prohibiting me to speak. But you can imagine what a threat I must have become to the institutions. Now, let me bring to this last point here that there is institutionalization of the rituals today. And there are several rituals that we can talk about, but I'm sure that you can see them on YouTube if you want to. Just see Karbala, see Najaf, all of these places, see Muharram, see Arba'in, the 40th of Imam Hussein, and you will see the rituals that are connected. What has happened to these rituals is they have been institutionalized. Once the ritual becomes institutionalized, as the Sufis taught us correctly, it loses connection with the spirituality. It becomes a source of identity. So you perform it without knowing why are you performing it. Because others are performing, you are performing it. Those rituals are there. They are completely being institutionalized through the travel. I call this post-Saddam development. When Saddam was still in power, the Shias could not visit Iraq freely. Only some Shias were allowed. Bohras could do that because they were not seen to be a threat to the government. But the 12 were not permitted. Iranians for many, many years did not go to Iraq. One of the major rituals that is different between Shia and the Sunni is the spiritual and devotional aspect of the wilaya. That they go and they visit their imams. They go and perform the pilgrimage. So this is, by the way, in addition to the pilgrimage that all Muslims perform, which is Hajj, which is going and visit Medina, the city of the Prophet. But these are the other places, and there are women saints as many as men saints. So in Cairo, you can visit, for example, Zainab. You can go in other places and visit all these shrines, Sayyidah Nafisa. All of these are buried, and these are the women of Ahlul Bayt, the family of the Prophet. This is when this becomes ritualized, this ziyarah is an important part of the Shia identity. In the modern times, it has become more easy to travel. And post-Saddam era has opened the shrine cities. The development of shrine cities is amazing. If you go and visit them, it is something. And I've seen Sunnis also visiting Iraq. All the shrines that the Sunni, the Shia visit, they are now visiting it. Also in Cairo, where you find the Ismaili community visits more often because there are shrines that belong to their imams there. In other words, there is this ritualization and institutionalization of the rituals. Kuwaitis, Bahrainis, all of them, they come to this. That's one of the important rituals. The second important ritual that has been very much institutionalized is, and it is competing now with Hajj, is the 40th day of Imam Hussein's, Imam Hussein, the Prophet's grandson's, martyrdom. So 40th day has now become larger than the Hajj in Iraq. I don't know this. I don't know how to find out whether these figures are correct or not. 25 million, they say, the Shia go on the 40th of Imam Hussein in Karbala. It is growing. One of the things that has happened is that it has revived one of the most important things that I learned from my Mormon friends, the idea of service. My Mormon friends tell me that something that the church is teaching us, because my children went to the Mormon church for their scouting, so I know what they were learning. And there was one very important virtue, that there is an idea of service, where you serve other people without any kind of discrimination in your mind. You try to do that. You try to do that. And that's what we find that Arba'in is revived. It has become international. There's so much money today that ordinary Shia, ordinary people can spend. And there are so many charity organizations. It's unimaginable how this small ritual of 10 days, by the way, and then you walk between the city of Najaf and Karbala, which is 83 kilometers. You walk that. And men and women and children, all of them are participants. Internationally, they go there. And this is unlike the Hajj, where you are bound by certain rituals. You must perform those. You must do those. Here, there is something that allows you to move freely. And you are being entertained by, it's almost like a carnival, that people are coming together. There's food being served. There is, religious songs being played, all of this, and this has become one of the most important source of identification today. But it is an identity that separates the community from the larger majority. It is not a Sunni practice. It is a Shia practice. Sunnis do participate, but it is a Shia practice that you go and visit Imam Hussein on foot. And they say, this is how Imam Hussein's sister Zainab, she traveled. When she was, imprisoned by Yazid, the Umayyad Caliph, that's when she was set free. She wanted to visit his brother's grave. And she went there, and she traveled on the camel, and she walked on the foot between these two places. And it has become one of the most cherished visit per year. My sons wanted to go, so they took me 3 years ago. Three of us went, but they walked. I could not walk 83 kilometers, but they did. And it is something that has become a symbol of the new kind of Shiism that is nurtured by very rich people. So I sit in Charlottesville, and I have 3 friends, and I say, I can send you to Iraq if you want for Arba'in, go. I'll pay for you. That kind of visits, by the way, it's so big issue today. And what has happened, there are now hospitals, clinics, built by Syrians, by Iranians, all over throughout the road that takes you. And it is amazing to see this kind of rituals that are not known in the Muslim. I, as a person, I've traveled, I've studied in Mustan Syria in Baghdad. I've studied in Iraq, in Najaf, and Iran. And all of these places where I've studied, I have never seen this phenomenon to this extent, so international. In other words, you have a new identity, not only identity that is connected with rituals, but identity that is connected with service. So you ask people, there are three books have come out in English, by the way, about Arba'in. And there were some American women who went and walked through, I don't remember their names, but there are 3 books that have been written, and they are describing what they asked, they did the field work. In other words, you discover that this, I think the modern times has made it possible for all of these things to come together in a place so remarkably, unknown until now. So you find that most of these, ideas of, we will not talk about our differences, we will not talk about, but we will talk about unity, but they're actually entrenched in diversity and in dividing rather than bringing together. And that's what I'm trying to emphasize, that modern times, with all its tools in traveling and everything that we are able to do, the differences between people are sometimes, they are narrowed. There are bridges of understanding if you travel, if you meet people, but there's also a time when you begin to differentiate yourself and you become separated from others. And that's what is, at the moment, the source of worries in the leaders. So let me conclude by saying that there are 2 kinds of Islam that I see. There's 2 kinds of Islam that I see. One is the Islam of the ulama, the scholars. And the other is the Islam of the populace. What I find to be quite revealing is that the populace is trying to find an Islam which has universal idiom. They are talking about not only the service, but they are also very much part of this movement towards virtuous life, something that is missing in the modern times. I connect Arba'in, this whole process of visiting Iraq for 10 days, is in a way trying to compensate self-alienation of the modern life. Modern life is very self-alienating. It is a very lonely life to live, you know it, You are living in the neighborhood, you don't know your neighbors for 30 years, Who is living next to you? There's no way that you could connect. I still remember going to Charlottesville, small place, and my wife cooking Middle Eastern food and sending to the neighbors here and here and here. Oh, we thought it will start conversation. That's how it happens in Cairo. That's how it happens, in Tehran. You go there and you live there and you cook something and they ask you, well, how did you make it? There was no questions. In Charlottesville, nobody was interested. Well, I used to go to Istanbul and write cards to my neighbors in Charlottesville, and they would not even respond. They were surprised. Why would I send a card to them? This must be very unusual. I think that kind of fear of the modern life, it's all being somehow compensated in something new that is happening. This religiosity is very different. It's not a regular religiosity. People are not talking about prayers 5 times. They're talking about freeing people. They're talking about sitting together and, having a conversation that is spiritual. I could go on in describing all these narratives, but I want to conclude that it's been a great opportunity for me to open this subject for the first time in this gathering. Thank you very much.